Right now, and I mean right now as you're hearing my voice, a rocket taller than the Statue of Liberty is standing inside a building in Florida, waiting. They rolled it back from the launch pad a few weeks ago because of a helium leak. The SLS rocket and its Orion capsule have been plagued by hydrogen leaks for years. They've posted a launch window opening April 1st. 4 astronauts, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen, are supposed to climb aboard that capsule and fly around the moon. Not land on it, just loop around it and come home. The first humans to leave low Earth orbit since December of 1972. That's over 50 years of silence between our planet and its closest neighbor. So the question everyone keeps asking, will it actually launch in April? Honestly, probably not. And the reasons why tell you everything about the strange, frustrating, sometimes heartbreaking story of humanity's return to the moon, a story that is far more complicated and far more interesting than most people realize. So settle in. Here's something most people don't think about. When NASA announces a launch date, that date is not just an engineering target, it's a political signal. Every date on that April launch window, April 1st, 2nd, 4th, 5th, and so on, each one was negotiated. Not just with physics and orbital mechanics, but with budgets, congressional hearings, and an administration that needs visible progress. Artemis is not Apollo. Apollo had a singular, almost irrational motivation: beat the Soviets. The budget reflected that. At its peak, NASA consumed over 4% of the entire federal budget. Today it gets less than 0.5%. And yet we're asking it to do something arguably harder: build a sustainable presence on the moon, not just plant a flag and leave. The SLS rocket itself is a perfect example of this tension. It is, without exaggeration, the most expensive rocket ever built. Each launch costs somewhere around $4 billion. Some estimates put it higher. For comparison, a SpaceX Falcon Heavy launch costs around $90 million. That's not a typo, we're talking about a factor of 40. So why does SLS exist? The answer has almost nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with geography. SLS is built using contracts spread across nearly every US state. The solid rocket boosters are made in Utah, the engines in Mississippi, the core stage in Louisiana, the assembly in Florida. Each of those states has senators. Each of those senators sits on committees that approve NASA's budget. SLS is sometimes called the Senate Launch System, and that nickname didn't come from nowhere. This matters because it explains the delays when your rocket is also a jobs program. The incentive structure shifts. Speed is no longer the priority. Continuation is. As long as the program keeps going, the contracts keep flowing. And that creates a strange situation where delays are almost acceptable. Now, I'm not saying the engineers don't care. They care deeply. The people welding the tanks, testing the valves, running the simulations, they want this to fly. But they're working inside a system that wasn't designed for urgency. And that system has consequences. Let's talk about what actually went wrong this time. Helium. Most people think of helium as the gas that makes balloons float and makes your voice squeaky. In rocketry, helium is something else entirely. It's a pressurant. You use it to push propellant, liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, from the tanks into the engines. Without helium pressure, the fuel just sits there, the engines starve. Helium is used because it's inert. It doesn't react with hydrogen or oxygen. It doesn't freeze at the absurdly cold temperatures inside cryogenic tanks. It's the perfect utility gas for rockets. But helium atoms are tiny, smaller than any other element except hydrogen itself. And that's the problem. Helium finds leaks that nothing else would. If you have a seal that holds nitrogen perfectly, helium might still seep through. It finds microscopic gaps in welds, O-rings, fittings, places where other gases would never escape. The SLS has had hydrogen leak issues going back to its very first wet dress rehearsal in 2022. They spent months chasing leaks, replacing seals, retesting. They eventually got Artemis 1, the uncrewed test flight, off the ground in November of that year. But now for Artemis 2, a new helium leak appeared in a different system. Here's what bothers engineers and what NASA's press releases don't emphasize. Each leak suggests that the overall plumbing architecture of SLS has tolerance issues. It's not one bad seal, it's a pattern. And patterns in aerospace are dangerous because they imply systemic problems rather than isolated ones. NASA says they've fixed it. Maybe they have. But the history of spaceflight is full of moments where we fixed it was followed by, wait, there's another one. Let me tell you how deep this helium problem goes, because it illuminates something essential about the way complex machines fail. When you build a rocket the size of SLS, you're dealing with literally miles of plumbing. Pipes, valves, manifolds, regulators, check valves, burst discs, relief valves, thousands of connections, each one a potential failure point. The helium system alone runs through multiple stages of the vehicle, from the core stage to the upper stage, through ground support equipment, through the mobile launcher, through umbilical connections that must seal perfectly and then disconnect cleanly at launch. Each connection point is a joint. Each joint has a seal. Each seal is designed to a specification, a certain material, a certain compression, a certain surface finish on the mating surfaces. And here's the thing about specifications. They describe the ideal. The real world delivers something close to the ideal, but never exactly it. There's always variation, manufacturing tolerance, a surface that's almost smooth enough, a seal that's almost compressed enough, a weld that's almost perfect. In most engineering, almost is fine. Your car engine has thousands of seals and gaskets, and they work despite being imperfect because the pressures are moderate and the fluids are forgiving. But in a rocket, the pressures are extreme, the temperatures are cryogenic, and the fluid you're trying to contain is the second smallest atom in the universe. Almost is not fine, almost is a helium leak. And there's another factor that makes this worse: thermal cycling. When you fill the SLS tanks with liquid hydrogen at minus 253 degrees Celsius, every metal component in the system contracts. When you drain the tanks and let them warm back up, everything expands. Each fill and drain cycle, each wet dress rehearsal, each scrub launch attempt puts the seals through a cycle of contraction and expansion. Over time, this can degrade seals that were perfectly good when they were installed. It's like bending a paperclip back and forth. Each bend is fine until it isn't. The SLS has been through multiple tanking cycles now. Each scrub, each rollback, each test means another cycle on the seals. The engineers know this. They inspect, they replace, they retest, but they can't replace everything every time. The vehicle is too complex, the schedule is too tight, and some components are in places that are extraordinarily difficult to access once the rocket is assembled. This is the fundamental tension of building a rocket that flies once or twice a year versus one that flies every week. SpaceX's Falcon 9 has flown over 300 times. Each flight teaches them something. Each anomaly is a data point. They iterate, they improve, they build institutional knowledge through repetition. SLS has flown once, one data point. You can't build a statistical understanding of your vehicle's behavior from one flight. You're essentially flying a prototype every time. Let's talk about the crew, because their stories are remarkable, and most coverage barely mentions them beyond their names. Reed Wiseman is the commander. He's a Navy test pilot, which, in the astronaut world, is almost a prerequisite for command roles. But here's what's less known. Wiseman was actually assigned to this mission years ago, back when it was supposed to launch in 2024. He's been training for a flight that keeps slipping. Imagine training for a marathon that keeps getting postponed. You peak, you maintain, you peak again. The psychological toll of that cycle is something NASA studies but rarely discusses publicly. Wiseman spent 165 days on the International Space Station back in 2014. He's been in the astronaut corps for over a decade. He served as the chief of the astronaut office, a prestigious administrative role that usually signals the end of your flying career, not the beginning of a new mission. But Wiseman stepped down from that role specifically to fly Artemis II. That tells you something about how badly he wants this. There's a particular kind of patience required of astronauts that civilians rarely appreciate. It's not the patience of waiting in line or waiting for a package to arrive. It's the patience of maintaining peak readiness for an event that might not happen for years. You train in simulators that replicate systems that are still being modified. You learn procedures that might change. You maintain physical fitness for a mission whose launch date is a moving target. And you do all of this while knowing that any medical issue, a torn ligament, a herniated disc, a change in vision, could disqualify you and put your backup in the seat instead. Astronauts don't talk about this much. The culture doesn't encourage it. The right stuff, as Tom Wolfe described it, includes a stoic acceptance of uncertainty. You don't complain, you don't express doubt, you train, you prepare, and you wait. And if the mission slips another 6 months, you nod and you keep training. Victor Glover is the pilot. He flew on SpaceX Crew 1 to the International Space Station, the first operational crewed flight of Crew Dragon. He'll be the first black astronaut to fly beyond low Earth orbit. That fact carries enormous weight, and Glover has spoken about it with remarkable thoughtfulness. He said he doesn't want to be defined by it, but he also doesn't want to ignore it. It matters. Representation in exploration matters because it shapes who dreams of going next. Glover's path to NASA is worth knowing. He grew up in Pomona, California, joined the Navy, became a test pilot, one of the most selective and dangerous jobs in military aviation, flew over 40 combat missions, applied to the astronaut corps, and was selected in 2013. His first space flight on Crew Dragon lasted 167 days. He performed 4 spacewalks. When Glover talks about being the first black astronaut to fly beyond low Earth orbit, he often references Ed Dwight. In 1963, President Kennedy pushed for Dwight, an Air Force pilot, to be included in astronaut training. Dwight completed the training but was never selected for a mission. He left the military and became a sculptor. For 60 years, Ed Dwight watched from the ground while other people flew to space. Then in 2024, at the age of 90, he finally made it on a Blue Origin suborbital flight. He saw the curvature of the Earth. He experienced weightlessness for about 3 minutes after 60 years of waiting. There's something in that story that breaks your heart and fills it at the same time. Glover's flight will be different. He won't be a passenger on a brief suborbital hop. He'll be the pilot of a spacecraft flying to the moon. He'll have his hands on the controls, or at least on the interface that connects him to the controls, since Orion is heavily automated, but symbolically and practically, he'll be one of the people responsible for getting this spacecraft around the moon and back. Christina Koch holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, 328 days on the space station. She was also part of the first all-female spacewalk with Jessica Meir. Koch is an electrical engineer by training, and she worked in Antarctica and in Arctic conditions before becoming an astronaut. She is by any measure one of the most experienced astronauts currently in the Corps. Koch's time in Antarctica is particularly relevant. She spent a winter at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, one of the most isolated places on Earth. During the Antarctic winter, it's dark for 6 months. Temperatures drop below -70 degrees Celsius, no flights in or out. If you have a medical emergency, you're on your own. The psychological parallels to a lunar mission are obvious, and it's not a coincidence that NASA values Antarctic experience in its astronauts. What's less discussed about Koch is her work on scientific instruments before she became an astronaut. She contributed to instruments on several NASA missions, including the Juno spacecraft orbiting Jupiter. She understands not just how to operate space hardware, but how it's designed and why. That depth of understanding becomes critical during anomalies when something doesn't work as expected and the crew needs to troubleshoot in real time, far from the engineers who built it. And then there's Jeremy Hansen. He's Canadian Space Agency, a fighter pilot and a geologist. That combination, military aviation and geology, is almost absurdly perfect for lunar exploration. Hansen will be the first Canadian to leave low Earth orbit. He won't walk on the moon on this mission, but his geological expertise is part of why Canada pushed so hard for a seat on this flight. They're thinking ahead. Hansen's presence on this mission is the result of a deal between NASA and the Canadian Space Agency that goes back years. Canada contributed the Canadarm, the robotic arm on the Space Shuttle, and the Canadarm2 on the International Space Station. For Artemis, Canada committed to building the Canadarm3 for the Gateway Station, a small space station that will orbit the Moon. In return, Canada got a seat on Artemis 2. This is how international space cooperation works. It's transactional, but it's also genuine. The Canadarm technologies have been essential to space operations for decades. Canada earned that seat, and Hansen is an excellent choice to fill it. His geological training means he can provide real-time scientific observations during the lunar flyby, identifying features, noting geological structures, making the kind of contextual observations that instruments alone can't capture. There's also something worth noting about Hansen's fighter pilot background. He flew CF-18 Hornets for the Royal Canadian Air Force. Fighter pilots are trained to make rapid, high-stakes decisions under extreme physiological stress, high G-forces, spatial disorientation, information overload. That training translates directly to spaceflight, where critical decisions sometimes must be made in seconds under conditions that no simulator can fully replicate. These 4 people have been waiting patiently, professionally, but waiting nonetheless. And every delay extends not just a schedule, it extends the period during which these human beings live in a kind of suspended animation, ready to go but not going. Most people assume Artemis 2 is a moon landing mission. It's not even close. Artemis 2 is a free return trajectory around the Moon. The crew will launch from Kennedy Space Center, enter Earth orbit, and then the upper stage of the SLS, called the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, will fire to send them toward the Moon. They'll swing around the far side using the Moon's gravity to curve their path back toward Earth. Total mission duration, about 10 days. They will not enter lunar orbit. They will not land. They will fly to roughly 6,200 miles from the lunar surface, at closest approach, see the far side with their own eyes and come home. Let me explain why the free return trajectory matters, because it's one of the most elegant concepts in orbital mechanics. A free return trajectory is a flight path that uses the Moon's gravity to bend the spacecraft's course and send it back to Earth without requiring any additional engine burns. If everything fails, if the engines won't restart, if the navigation computer dies, if every system on board goes dark, the laws of physics will still bring the crew home. The moon's gravity does the work. This is not a theoretical concern. It saved the crew of Apollo 13. When an oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon, the astronauts couldn't turn around. They were already on a trajectory that would take them around the moon. But because they were on a free return trajectory, or close enough to one, that a small correction burn could put them on one, the moon's gravity swung them around and sent them back toward Earth. Without that trajectory, Lovell, Swigert and Hazy would have drifted past the moon and into deep space forever. Artemis II will use a similar principle, but with a more complex flight path than any Apollo free return mission. The plan calls for the crew to first enter a high Earth orbit, spend time testing Orion's systems, and then perform the translunar injection burn. The trajectory will take them farther from Earth than any human has traveled, about 230,000 miles, before the moon's gravity curves them back. The reason for the complexity is testing. Apollo free return trajectories were designed to be as simple and safe as possible because the spacecraft was unproven and the priority was survival. Artemis II's trajectory is designed to test as many Orion systems as possible in as many operational modes as possible, while still maintaining the safety net of a free return path. Now, this might sound underwhelming compared to Apollo, but there are critical things happening on this flight that never happened on Apollo. First, the Orion capsule's life support system will be fully tested with humans aboard for the first time. On Artemis I, the uncrewed flight, they put a mannequin named Commander Munikin Campos in the seat with radiation sensors. That test went well, but a mannequin doesn't breathe, doesn't sweat, doesn't produce carbon dioxide, doesn't need a functioning toilet. Artemis II tests all of that. The life support system aboard Orion is technically called the Environmental Control and Life Support System, or ECLSS. It's responsible for maintaining breathable air, managing temperature and humidity, removing carbon dioxide and handling waste. On the space station, ECLSS is a complex multi-room system with redundancies and backup options. On Orion, it has to do everything in a much smaller space with fewer redundancies, and it has to work perfectly for 10 days without any possibility of resupply or repair from the ground. Carbon dioxide removal is particularly critical. Humans exhale carbon dioxide with every breath. In the enclosed space of a spacecraft, CO2 levels build up quickly. At elevated concentrations, carbon dioxide causes headaches, impaired cognitive function, and eventually unconsciousness and death. The system that scrubs CO2 from Orion's air uses lithium hydroxide canisters, a proven technology, but one that has a finite capacity. The mission timeline is partly dictated by how many canisters they can carry. There's also the question of humidity. 4 humans in a sealed space generate a surprising amount of moisture through breathing, sweating, and simply existing. That moisture has to be removed from the air, or it will condense on cold surfaces, potentially causing electrical shorts or fostering microbial growth. The dehumidification system on Orion is integrated with the thermal control system, which manages heat rejection through radiators on the service module. It's an elegant design, but it's never been tested with 4 living, breathing, sweating humans aboard in deep space. And then there's the toilet. This might seem trivial, but waste management in space is one of the most persistently challenging aspects of human spaceflight. The absence of gravity means that conventional plumbing doesn't work. Everything floats, including things you very much want to not float. The Orion waste management system uses airflow to direct waste into containment, but it's a small system designed for short missions. 4 people using it for 10 days will be a genuine test of its capacity and its crew acceptability, which is a polite engineering term for whether the astronauts can tolerate using it without losing their minds. Second, the heat shield. This is the part that worries engineers the most. On Artemis 1, the heat shield performed within acceptable limits, but post-flight analysis revealed something unexpected. The ablative material, the stuff that burns away to absorb heat during re-entry, eroded unevenly. In some spots, chunks came off in a pattern that didn't match prediction. NASA has spent months analyzing this, running new simulations, and has concluded the heat shield is safe for crew. But concluded it's safe is not the same as fully understands why it behaved unexpectedly. Let me go deeper on this because it's genuinely one of the most consequential technical issues facing Artemis, and it doesn't get the attention it deserves. Orion's heat shield is the largest ablative heat shield ever built. It measures about 16.5 feet in diameter. The ablative material is called coat and is applied in blocks that are bonded to the underlying structure. During re-entry, the surface of the heat shield reaches temperatures approaching 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, the coat material doesn't just melt, it sublimates, transitioning directly from solid to gas. As it does, it carries heat energy away from the spacecraft. The ablation, the wearing away, is the mechanism of protection. The heat shield is designed to destroy itself to save the crew. On Artemis 1, the heat shield did its job. The capsule survived re-entry. The internal temperatures remained within safe limits. By that measure, it was a success. But when engineers examined the heat shield after recovery, they found that the ablation pattern was irregular. In some areas, the coat had worn away smoothly, as expected. In others, chunks had separated. Pieces of material had come off, not through gradual ablation, but through a process more like spalling, where mechanical forces cause sections to break away. This matters because the heat shield's performance must be predictable, not just adequate. If chunks are separating unpredictably, there's a risk, perhaps small but non-zero, that a chunk could separate at the wrong time in the wrong place, exposing the underlying structure to temperatures it can't withstand. Or a chunk could strike another part of the spacecraft during re-entry, damaging a parachute housing or a critical antenna. NASA convened a review board. They ran computational fluid dynamics simulations. They tested coat samples in arc jet facilities which simulate re-entry conditions on the ground. They concluded that the charring and liberation, their term for the chunk separation, was within acceptable limits and that the heat shield is safe for a crewed mission. But here's the nuance that matters. The models they used to predict heat shield behavior before Artemis 1 did not predict the charring pattern they observed. They've updated the models since then, but updated models are just models. They haven't been validated against another flight because there hasn't been another flight. Artemis 2 will be, in a sense, the validation flight for a heat shield protecting 4 human lives. This is an important nuance. In aerospace, there's a difference between it worked and we understand why it worked. The first gives you confidence for the next flight. The second gives you confidence for every flight after that. NASA is still working on the second part. There's a historical parallel worth mentioning. The Space Shuttle Columbia was lost in 2003 because a piece of foam insulation broke off the external tank during launch and struck the left wing's heat shield, creating a breach. During re-entry, superheated plasma entered the wing through the breach and destroyed the vehicle's internal structure. 7 crew members were killed. The foam shedding wasn't new. It had happened on previous flights. Engineers had noticed it. They'd raised concerns. But because previous foam strikes hadn't caused catastrophic damage, the phenomenon was gradually normalized. It was reclassified from a safety concern to a maintenance issue. This is what sociologist Diane Vaughan called the normalization of deviance, the process by which abnormal events become accepted as normal through repeated occurrence without catastrophic consequence. I'm not saying the Orion heat shield issue is analogous to Columbia's foam problem. The physics are different, the failure modes are different, and NASA's institutional response has been far more rigorous this time. But the structural parallel and unexpected behavior in a thermal protection system that is acknowledged but not fully understood is worth noting. It's worth noting because the only antidote to normalization of deviance is eternal vigilance, and eternal vigilance is exhausting and expensive. Third, and this is barely discussed, Artemis 2 will test the communication and navigation systems in a deep space environment with crew interactions. The delay between Earth and a spacecraft near the Moon is about 1.3 seconds each way. That's nothing compared to Mars, but it's enough to make real-time piloting impossible during critical moments. The crew needs to demonstrate they can manage systems semi-autonomously during the far side pass, when they'll be completely out of contact with Earth for about 30 minutes. 30 minutes of radio silence behind the Moon, farther from home than any human in over 5 decades. Think about that. During those 30 minutes, the crew will be entirely on their own, no mission control, no telemetry downlink, no one monitoring their systems, their health, their trajectory. If something goes wrong, a thruster misfire, a warning alarm, a cabin pressure anomaly, they'll have to diagnose and respond using only their training and the information available inside the capsule. This is fundamentally different from how we've operated in space for the last 2 decades. On the International Space Station, there is near continuous communication with the ground. Flight controllers monitor every system around the clock. If an anomaly occurs, the crew's first action is usually to call Houston. That option won't exist behind the Moon. NASA has been training the crew for this using a technique called loss of signal drills. During simulations, communication with mission control is deliberately cut off, and the crew must manage whatever scenario is thrown at them. These drills are realistic and stressful, but they're still simulations. The psychological reality of being genuinely out of contact, knowing that no one on Earth can hear you, help you, or even see what's happening, is something that only the actual mission will reveal. The Apollo astronauts experienced this, of course, and their descriptions are fascinating. Michael Collins, who orbited the Moon alone in the command module while Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface, was perhaps the most isolated human being in history. When he passed behind the Moon, he was cut off from both his crewmates on the surface and from Earth. He later wrote that he didn't feel lonely. He felt awareness, a heightened, almost meditative sense of his own existence, alone in the void, with only the hum of the spacecraft for company. Not everyone would react that way. Isolation affects people differently, and the Artemis 2 crew will have the advantage of having each other. 4 people in a capsule is different from 1 person in a capsule. The social dynamics, who leads, who supports, who manages stress through humor, who manages it through focus, these dynamics will play out in real time during those 30 minutes of silence. Here's something that surprises a lot of people, even space enthusiasts. We've lost knowledge. Actual, practical, hard-won knowledge about how to go to the Moon. When Apollo ended, NASA didn't neatly archive everything into a searchable database. Much of the institutional knowledge, the tricks, the workarounds, the things engineers knew in their bones, walked out the door with the people who retired. Some documentation was lost. Some was archived in formats that are now unreadable. Some was simply never written down because it was considered obvious at the time. The F1 engine that powered the Saturn V first stage is a perfect example. When engineers at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center tried to study the F1 for potential reuse in new rockets, they found that the manufacturing processes were partially undocumented. The people who built those engines had used techniques that were more craft than science, adjustments made by feel, by experience, by intuition. That knowledge died with them or retired with them. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates this beautifully. The F1's combustion chamber injector plate, the component that sprays fuel and oxidizer into the combustion chamber in a precise pattern to ensure efficient, stable burning, was one of the most problematic components during development. Early F1 engines suffered from combustion instability, the phenomenon where pressure oscillations inside the combustion chamber build on themselves, creating vibrations powerful enough to tear the engine apart. The engineers eventually solved it, but the solution involved modifications to the injector plate that were arrived at through thousands of tests, trial and error, adjusting hole sizes, changing patterns, adding baffles. The final design worked, but the reasoning behind each specific modification wasn't always recorded. The engineers knew that a certain baffle height worked. They didn't always document why they'd tried that specific height, or what happened when they tried other heights. Decades later, when new engineers tried to understand the F1's injector design using modern computational tools, they could model the physics, they could simulate the combustion process. But their simulations sometimes predicted instabilities in configurations that the original engineers had found stable, and vice versa. The models and the hardware disagreed, and without the original engineers to explain the discrepancies, most of them were dead by then. The new team was left with a gap between theory and practice that they couldn't fully bridge. This is actually a phenomenon that extends beyond space. It happens with any complex technology that isn't continuously practiced. The recipe for Roman concrete was lost for centuries. Only recently have materials scientists figured out that Roman concrete contained lime clasts, chunks of calcium-rich material that gave it a self-healing property. When cracks formed, water would seep in and react with the lime, forming calcium carbonate that filled the crack. The Romans may not have understood the chemistry, but they knew the recipe worked. When the recipe was lost, the knowledge was lost too, and 2,000 years of concrete technology went in a different direction. The technique for making certain medieval stained glass is still not fully understood. The vibrant reds and blues in cathedral windows from the 12th and 13th centuries were created using nanoparticles of gold and silver, nanotechnology, centuries before the word existed. The craftsmen didn't know they were using nanoparticles. They knew that certain additives heated to certain temperatures produced certain colors. The knowledge was procedural, not theoretical. And when the craft traditions were disrupted by wars, plagues, and changing architectural fashions, the procedures were lost. The phenomenon even extends to nuclear weapons. The United States stopped testing nuclear weapons in 1992. Since then, the stockpile has been maintained through a program of surveillance and simulation. But the people who designed and built the current weapons are retiring and dying. The stockpile stewardship program is, in part, an effort to recreate institutional knowledge that's being lost, to understand, through modeling and non-explosive experiments, exactly how these devices work at a level of detail that the original builders might have known intuitively but didn't. Formally document. Knowledge that isn't actively maintained decays. This is a law as reliable as thermodynamics, and it applies to organizations just as it applies to physical systems. And this is part of why Artemis is so expensive and so slow. We're not building on Apollo. We're building beside it, occasionally glancing at its remains for hints to truly understand why the return to the moon has taken so long. You need to understand what happened in the decades between Apollo and Artemis, because it's not as though NASA sat idle. They were busy. They were just busy doing something else. After Apollo 17 in December 1972, the direction of human spaceflight shifted fundamentally. The remaining Apollo hardware, there were rockets and capsules built for missions 18, 19 and 20, was repurposed or sent to museums. The Saturn V production line was shut down, the factories were retooled, and NASA pivoted to the Space Transportation System, the Space Shuttle. The shuttle was supposed to be everything Apollo wasn't: reusable, routine, affordable. The pitch to Congress was irresistible: a vehicle that could launch like a rocket, operate in orbit like a spacecraft, and land like an airplane. It would fly so frequently, early projections suggested 50 or more flights per year, that the cost per mission would plummet. Space access would become as routine as airline travel. None of that happened. The shuttle never flew more than 9 times in a single year. Each flight cost approximately $450 million. Some estimates put the fully burdened cost, including all infrastructure, at over $1.5 billion. The vehicle was complex, fragile, and demanded months of refurbishment between flights. And it killed 14 people in 2 catastrophic accidents. But the shuttle's most consequential effect on lunar exploration wasn't its cost or its danger. It was its destination. The shuttle could only reach low Earth orbit about 250 miles up. It couldn't go to the moon. It wasn't designed to, and because NASA's budget was consumed by shuttle operations, there was no money left to develop a vehicle that could. For 3 decades, from 1981 to 2011, American human spaceflight was confined to low Earth orbit. The shuttle built the International Space Station, an extraordinary engineering achievement, but one that orbits just 250 miles above Earth's surface. The moon is 1,000 times farther away. During those decades, there were proposals to return to the moon. George H.W. Bush announced the Space Exploration Initiative in 1989, calling for a return to the moon and then a journey to Mars. NASA's estimated cost, $400 billion. Congress said no. The initiative died. George W. Bush announced the vision for space exploration in 2004, calling for a return to the moon by 2020. NASA began developing the Constellation program, the Ares 1 and Ares 5 rockets, and the Orion capsule. Real hardware was being built, test flights were being planned. Then Barack Obama took office. An independent review committee, the Augustine Commission, concluded that Constellation was significantly over budget, behind schedule, and unlikely to return humans to the moon before the late 2020s at best. Obama cancelled Constellation in 2010. But here's the twist. Congress didn't let state. Congress Congress mandated that NASA continue developing both, specifying the contractors and even some of the design parameters in the legislation itself. This was unusual. Congress was not just funding a space program, it was designing one. The result was a rocket that carried the DNA of decisions made by legislators, not engineers. The requirement to use space shuttle-derived hardware, shuttle main engines, shuttle-era solid rocket boosters, shuttle-era tooling and manufacturing facilities was written into law. These requirements ensured that the existing workforce would remain employed and the existing supply chain would remain active. They also ensured that SLS would inherit the costs, complexities and limitations of shuttle-era technology. This is the genealogy of the rocket sitting in Florida right now. It is not a clean sheet design, it is a political compromise with engines. And understanding that genealogy is essential to understanding why it costs $4 billion per launch, why it has chronic leak problems, and why it is, despite everything, still the only rocket currently capable of sending humans to the moon. Let me turn now to the thing that hangs over the SLS program like a shadow that gets larger every year. Starship, SpaceX's Starship is, if it works as intended, a revolution, not an evolution, a revolution. It's the largest and most powerful rocket ever built. Standing nearly 400 feet tall, its first stage, called Super Heavy, generates roughly 16.7 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, more than twice the Saturn V. The upper stage, called Starship, is itself a spacecraft capable of carrying over 100 tons to low Earth orbit in its expendable configuration. But the truly revolutionary aspect isn't the size or the thrust, it's the economics. Starship is designed to be fully reusable. Both stages are intended to return to the launch site and be reflown with minimal refurbishment. If SpaceX achieves this, and it's a significant if, the cost per launch could drop to the tens of millions of dollars. Some of SpaceX's internal projections suggest costs as low as $10 million per flight at high flight rates. Compare that to SLS at $4 billion. The ratio isn't just unfavorable, it's existentially threatening to the entire SLS program. If Starship becomes operational and reliable, the rationale for SLS evaporates. Why spend $4 billion to launch one mission when you could spend a fraction of that to launch many? This comparison is not lost on anyone at NASA, at Boeing, at Northrop Grumman, or on Capitol Hill. It hangs in the air at every budget hearing, every program review, every press conference. The SLS workforce knows that their rocket might be the last of its kind, a monument to a way of doing business that is being disrupted in real time. But Starship is not ready, and that's the uncomfortable reality that complicates the narrative. As of early 2025, Starship has completed a handful of integrated flight tests. The progress has been dramatic. Each test has gone further than the last, and the most recent flights have demonstrated controlled descent of the Super Heavy booster back to the launch site, caught by the mechanical arms of the launch tower. That is an astonishing achievement, but Starship has not reached orbit and returned successfully. It has not demonstrated on-orbit refueling, it has not flown to the moon, it has not landed on the moon. Each of those milestones involves engineering challenges that have never been solved by anyone, and some of them, particularly the orbital refueling of cryogenic propellants at scale, represent genuine technological frontiers. The orbital refueling challenge deserves special attention because it's the linchpin of the entire Artemis architecture. The Starship human landing system, the variant that will land on the moon for Artemis 3, is too massive to reach the moon on a single tank of fuel. It needs to be refueled in orbit before heading to the moon. The current plan calls for multiple tanker flights. Some estimates suggest between 8 and 16 to transfer propellant in orbit before the HLS can depart for the moon. Transferring cryogenic propellants in orbit is not simply a matter of pumping liquid from one tank to another. In the absence of gravity, liquids don't settle at the bottom of a tank. They form floating blobs, adhering to whatever surface they touch through capillary forces. Getting the liquid to flow from one spacecraft to another requires either spin stabilization to create artificial gravity, ullage motors to settle the propellant, or sophisticated capillary devices to manage the liquid-gas interface. And there's another problem: boil-off. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen are stored at extremely cold temperatures in the thermal environment of orbit. Heat leaks into the tanks continuously despite insulation. The propellant gradually warms up and boils. If you take too long between tanker deliveries, the propellant already in the depot boils faster than you can replace it. The entire refueling operation becomes a race against thermodynamics. SpaceX plans to address this through rapid launch cadence, flying tanker missions in quick succession, minimizing the time between deliveries. But this requires a launch rate for Starship that has never been achieved for any vehicle in history. It requires the launch infrastructure, pads, tanks, ground support to support flights separated by days, not weeks or months. Will they pull it off? My instinct says eventually yes. SpaceX has a track record of solving problems that others consider impossible, but the timeline is uncertain. And the Artemis program's schedule depends on a capability that doesn't yet exist, being developed by a company whose timeline estimates are famously aggressive. NASA selected SpaceX's Starship as the human landing system for Artemis 3. That means even if SLS and Orion perform perfectly, the actual moon landing depends on a vehicle that has never reached orbit with its full stack intact, has never been refueled in space, and has never attempted a lunar landing. The architecture NASA chose is breathtakingly ambitious. Starship HLS, the lunar lander variant, needs to launch to orbit, be refueled by multiple tanker flights of other starships, fly to lunar orbit, wait for the Orion crew to arrive, transfer the crew, descend to the surface, spend time on the moon, ascend back to lunar orbit, transfer the crew back to Orion, and then be disposed of. Each of those steps is a significant engineering challenge. Several of them have never been done by anyone, ever. Orbital refueling of cryogenic propellants at the scale required, nobody has done that. Landing a vehicle the size of a 15-story building on the moon with no launch pad, no ground support, just retro propulsion onto regolith. Nobody has done that either. The landing challenge alone is worth discussing in detail. When the Apollo lunar module descended to the moon's surface, it was a relatively small vehicle, about 23 feet tall, weighing about 33,000 pounds at landing. The astronauts could see the surface through their windows and make last-second adjustments to avoid boulders or craters. Armstrong famously took manual control during the Apollo 11 landing and flew laterally to avoid a boulder field, landing with about 25 seconds of fuel remaining. Starship HLS is a fundamentally different proposition. It's about 50 meters tall, roughly a 16-story building, and will weigh substantially more than the lunar module at landing. The crew compartment is near the top of the vehicle, perhaps 40 meters above the surface. They won't be able to see directly below them. They'll be relying on cameras, sensors, and automated systems to guide them to the surface. And then there's the exhaust plume problem. When a rocket engine fires near the moon's surface, the exhaust hits the regolith and sends material flying. On the moon, with no atmosphere, ejected particles travel in ballistic trajectories. They don't slow down the way they would in air. They can travel enormous distances and at high velocities. Apollo's lunar module descent engine created noticeable surface disturbance, but the engine was relatively small. Starship's engines are much more powerful. The interaction between Starship's exhaust plume and the lunar regolith is not well understood, and there are concerns that the landing could create a significant crater beneath the vehicle, potentially destabilizing the landing surface itself. NASA and SpaceX are working on this. There have been studies of exhaust regolith interaction. There may be solutions, landing pads deployed in advance by robotic missions, engine configurations that spread the thrust over a wider area, throttle profiles that minimize surface disturbance. But these solutions need to be tested on the moon, and you can only test them on the moon by actually going there. It's a chicken and egg problem of the most literal kind. The honest assessment is that Artemis 3, the actual moon landing, is unlikely before 2028 at the earliest. Some analysts say 2030 is more realistic, which means China might land humans on the moon at roughly the same time as NASA, despite having started their crewed program decades later. That's not a failure of American engineering. It's a consequence of the system within which American engineering operates. While NASA wrestles with helium leaks and heat shield anomalies, others are not standing still. China has publicly stated its intention to land taikonauts on the moon by 2030. Their program, led by the China Manned Space Agency, has been executing with a consistency that catches Western observers off guard. They've landed robotic missions on the far side of the moon. They've returned samples from the far side, a first for any nation. They're building a heavy lift rocket called the Long March 10 specifically for crewed lunar missions. Let me walk through China's lunar program because its coherence is striking. In 2013, Chang'e 3 landed on the moon and deployed the U-2 rover. In 2019, Chang'e 4 became the first spacecraft to land on the far side of the moon, something no other nation has accomplished. In 2020, Chang'e 5 returned lunar samples to Earth, and in 2024, Chang'e 6 returned samples from the far side, another first. Each mission built on the previous one, each accomplished something new. The progression was methodical, incremental, and remarkably free of major setbacks. This is not the approach of a program that's rushing, it's the approach of a program that's patient, confident, and thinking in decades. The Long March 10 rocket is being developed specifically for crewed lunar missions. It won't be as powerful as SLS or Starship, but the Chinese architecture doesn't require it to be. Their plan calls for 2 Long March 10 launches per mission, one carrying the crew in a new generation crewed spacecraft, and one carrying the lunar lander. The two elements rendezvous and dock in lunar orbit. The crew transfers to the lander, descends to the surface, and returns. This architecture is, in some ways, more conservative than NASA's Artemis plan. It doesn't require orbital refueling. It doesn't depend on a vehicle the size of a skyscraper landing on the moon. Each component is closer in scale to what's been proven before. That conservatism is a strength. It reduces risk. It increases the probability that the plan will actually work on the timeline they've stated. Here's what's different about China's approach. They don't talk much. They don't hold press conferences every time a bolt is tightened. They announce missions shortly before execution and usually succeed. This is culturally and strategically almost the opposite of NASA's approach, where every milestone, every delay, every review board finding is publicly documented and debated. The result is that many people underestimate China's progress. They shouldn't. The Chinese lunar program is methodical, well-funded, and critically it has political continuity. Leadership transitions in China don't reset the space program the way US presidential transitions sometimes do. A plan set in 2015 is still the plan in 2025. That kind of stability is extraordinarily valuable in a domain where programs span decades. There's a geopolitical dimension to this that goes beyond mere competition. The Artemis Accords, a set of principles governing lunar exploration that the United States has been encouraging nations to sign, represent one vision of how activity on the moon should be governed. Over 30 nations have signed so far. China has not and will not. China is pursuing its own framework, the International Lunar Research Station, in partnership with Russia and other countries. The result is that two parallel frameworks for lunar governance are emerging. This isn't necessarily a Cold War scenario. The physics of the moon are the same regardless of who's exploring it, but it does mean that questions of resource rights, landing site coordination, heritage site protection, and interference prevention will need to be negotiated across geopolitical lines. And those negotiations will be shaped by who's actually present on the moon, which is shaped by who gets there and stays there. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the foundational legal framework for space, says that no nation can claim sovereignty over celestial bodies, but it's notably silent on resource extraction. Can you mine lunar water ice? The Artemis Accords say yes, subject to certain principles. The Outer Space Treaty doesn't explicitly say no, but it also doesn't explicitly say yes. This ambiguity will become increasingly uncomfortable as actual mining operations approach feasibility. And Russia, it's worth a brief digression to talk about Russia, because its absence from the current lunar narrative is itself a story. Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, was the first to reach the moon with a robotic spacecraft. Luna 2 impacted the lunar surface in 1959. Luna 3 photographed the far side for the first time. Luna 9 made the first soft landing. Luna 16 returned the first robotic sample. The lunar-cooled rovers explored the surface. The Soviet lunar program was extraordinary in its accomplishments. But the crude lunar program, the one intended to beat Apollo, failed. The N-1 rocket, the Soviet equivalent of the Saturn V, exploded on all four of its launch attempts. The program was cancelled, and the Soviets publicly claimed they had never been trying to send humans to the moon, a face-saving lie that persisted for decades. Today, Russia's space program is a shadow of its Soviet predecessor. Budget cuts, corruption, brain drain, and political isolation have degraded its capabilities significantly. The Luna 25 mission in 2023, Russia's first lunar mission in nearly 50 years, crashed into the moon due to a software error. Russia is nominally a partner in China's International Lunar Research Station, but its contribution is uncertain. The era of Russian leadership in space exploration appears to be over, at least for now. The implications of this for the broader geopolitical landscape of lunar exploration are significant. China is emerging as the primary alternative to American leadership in space, and it's doing so with a program that's increasingly self-sufficient. Let me take a different turn for a moment. Let's talk about what it's actually like to stand on the moon, because the Apollo astronauts described experiences that are so alien, so far outside normal human existence, that they deserve to be revisited. The first thing every astronaut mentions is the silence. Not quiet, silence. There's no atmosphere on the moon, so there's no sound transmission through the air. You can hear your own breathing inside the suit. You can hear the whir of the life support fans, the hiss of oxygen flow, but outside nothing. You could fire a cannon 10 feet away and you would see the flash, see the debris, but hear absolutely nothing. The only external sounds come through your boots, vibrations traveling through the suit when you step on the surface, a muffled crunch. The sky is black, not dark blue, not deep navy black. In every direction above the horizon, space, stars. If your visor isn't reflecting sunlight and Earth, hanging there about 4 times larger than the moon appears from Earth, blue and white and impossibly vivid against that absolute blackness, Buzz Aldrin called the lunar landscape magnificent desolation. That phrase is so precise, it's almost scientific. There is a stark, severe beauty to the moon, but it is beauty without life, without softness, without anything familiar. The colors are limited to grays, tans, and subtle browns. The shadows are razor sharp because there's no atmosphere to scatter light. If you stand with 1 foot in sunlight and 1 in shadow, one boot might be 250 degrees Fahrenheit and the other might be minus 280. The temperature gradient across a single shadow line is extreme enough to stress materials. And then there's the gravity 1/6 of Earth's. The astronauts discovered that walking normally doesn't really work. Your legs push off with the same force as on Earth, but you go 6 times higher and you hang in the air for what feels like an eternity. Most of them settled on a bouncing, loping gait, a kind of controlled hop that looks strange on video, but apparently feels natural after a few minutes. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist on Apollo 17, described it as moving like he was on a trampoline, but a trampoline that extended in every direction. Schmidt's experience on the moon is particularly worth discussing because he was the only trained scientist to walk on the lunar surface during Apollo. All the other moonwalkers were military test pilots. Excellent observers, disciplined recorders of what they saw, but not trained in the art of reading landscapes the way a geologist is. Schmitt arrived at the Taurus-Littrow Valley and immediately began interpreting what he saw in geological terms. He identified different rock types, noted stratigraphic relationships, recognized impact melt samples, and then he found the orange soil, a deposit of tiny volcanic glass beads that indicated relatively recent volcanic activity. Recent in geological terms, meaning a few billion years rather than 4 billion, but still evidence that the moon had been more geologically active than many had assumed. That discovery happened because a trained geologist was on the surface, moving through the landscape, noticing subtleties that a camera or a rover might miss. The color of the soil changed in a small area, and Schmidt's training caused him to stop, look closer, and realize he was seeing something significant. A robot might have driven right over it. This is one of the fundamental arguments for sending humans to the moon rather than just robots. Robots are excellent at executing predetermined tasks. They can drill, sample, photograph, and measure with precision that exceeds human capability. But they struggle with the unexpected. They don't notice. They don't say, "Wait, that looks different, let me check." They don't have the contextual awareness that allows a trained human to recognize significance in anomaly. The regolith, the lunar soil, is extraordinary stuff. It's not like Earth soil. There are no organic components, no water, no weathering in the traditional sense. Instead, billions of years of micrometeorite impacts have shattered the surface rock into a fine, abrasive powder. The particles are tiny, angular, and electrostatically charged. They cling to everything. Spacesuits, tools, visors, sample bags. The Apollo astronauts reported that lunar dust was one of their biggest problems. It got into the spacecraft, made surfaces slippery, scratched visors, and irritated lungs. Gene Cernan said if they'd stayed on the moon one more day, the dust would have compromised their suit seals. Let me explain why lunar dust is so much worse than Earth dust. Because the physics is fascinating and the implications for long-duration missions are severe. On Earth, dust particles are weathered. Water, wind, and biological activity smooth their edges over time. An Earth dust particle viewed under a microscope typically has rounded edges and a relatively smooth surface. Lunar dust particles have never been weathered. There's no water, no wind, no biology. The only processes that shape them are impacts, micrometeorite bombardment that shatters larger rocks into smaller fragments. Each fragment is sharp-edged, angular and jagged. Under a microscope, lunar dust looks like broken glass, because essentially that's what it is, broken glass made of silicate minerals. Additionally, lunar dust is electrostatically charged. Solar ultraviolet radiation and the solar wind strip electrons from the surface particles, giving them a net positive charge on the sunlit side and a negative charge on the shadow side. This charge causes the particles to cling to surfaces with surprising tenacity. You can't just brush it off. It adheres electrostatically and mechanically. The sharp edges dig into the fabric of spacesuits, the glass surfaces of visors, the rubber of seals. The health implications are concerning. When Apollo astronauts brought lunar dust into the spacecraft on their suits, they inhaled it. Several reported a distinctive smell described as similar to spent gunpowder, and some experienced nasal congestion and throat irritation. The particles are small enough to penetrate deep into the lungs, and their sharp, glassy structure could potentially cause long-term damage, similar to silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling crystalline silica dust on Earth. For Artemis missions lasting days or weeks on the surface, dust mitigation is a critical engineering challenge. How do you keep it out of habitats? How do you prevent it from degrading equipment? How do you protect astronauts' lungs from something that is essentially microscopic glass shards? Several approaches are being studied. Electrodynamic dust shields use oscillating electric fields to repel charged particles from surfaces. Anti-static coatings could reduce the electrostatic adhesion. Airlock designs with dust removal systems, air showers, vacuum cleaners, electromagnetic brushes could minimize the amount of dust that enters habitats. But none of these solutions have been tested on the Moon. They've been tested in labs with simulants, materials designed to mimic lunar regolith, but simulants are approximations, not replicas. The actual lunar environment may present surprises. This is not a solved problem. It is one of the most significant unsolved engineering challenges for sustained lunar habitation. Artemis 3, the mission after Artemis 2, is supposed to land humans near the lunar South Pole. This is a fundamentally different destination than where Apollo went, and the reasons are fascinating. Apollo missions landed in the equatorial regions of the Moon, wide flat plains of ancient lava called Maria. The lighting was good, the terrain was manageable, and the communication geometry with Earth was favorable. It made sense for first attempts. The South Pole is an entirely different world. Near the pole, the sun hangs perpetually near the horizon. It never rises high. This creates a landscape of extreme contrasts, peaks that are bathed in near-constant sunlight, and craters that haven't seen a single photon of sunlight in billions of years. Those permanently shadowed craters are what everyone is after. Temperatures inside them drop to minus 230 degrees Celsius, colder than the surface of Pluto, and at those temperatures water ice can survive indefinitely. Not liquid water, ice, mixed into the regolith, possibly in thin layers, possibly in scattered crystals. We know the ice is there. Multiple missions have confirmed it. India's Chandrayaan-1 detected hydroxyl signatures. NASA's L-Cross mission crashed a spent rocket stage into a shadowed crater and observed water in the debris plume. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has mapped the distribution of potential ice deposits. But here's what we don't know, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting. We don't know the form of this water ice. Is it a solid block, a frost mixed with soil? Individual molecules trapped in the crystal lattice of minerals? The answer matters enormously because it determines whether you can extract it practically. If the ice is concentrated, slabs or thick deposits, you could potentially mine it with relatively simple equipment. Melt it, filter it, electrolyze it into hydrogen and oxygen. Drinking water, breathable air, rocket propellant, a gas station on the moon. If the ice is diffuse, individual molecules scattered through regolith, extraction becomes an industrial-scale problem. You'd need to process enormous volumes of lunar soil, heating it to release tiny amounts of water. Still possible, but far harder and far more energy-intensive. The process of extracting and using local resources is called in situ resource utilization, or ISRU. It's a term you'll hear constantly in discussions about lunar and Martian exploration, and it represents a fundamental shift in how we think about space missions. Every Apollo mission carried everything it needed from Earth. Every gram of water, every liter of oxygen, every pound of fuel for the return trip, all launched from the surface of the Earth at tremendous cost. The tyranny of the rocket equation means that every kilogram you add to the spacecraft requires additional fuel to launch, and that additional fuel requires additional fuel to launch it, and so on. By the time you account for the full chain, getting 1 kilogram of anything to the lunar surface costs tens of thousands of dollars. ISRU breaks this chain. If you can produce water, oxygen and fuel on the moon from local materials, you don't have to launch them from Earth. The savings are not incremental, they're transformative. A lunar base with effective ISRU capabilities becomes economically viable in a way that an Apollo-style bring everything from home approach never can. But ISRU is unproven at any meaningful scale. The technology exists in laboratories. Small demonstration units have been built and tested, but the gap between a laboratory demonstrator and a production-scale lunar mining operation is enormous. It's the gap between a chemistry experiment and a chemical plant. This question, the form of the ice, is one of the most important unanswered questions in planetary science right now, and it's one of the key reasons NASA wants to land humans at the South Pole. Robots can tell you water is present. Humans with geological training can tell you what form it takes, how it's distributed, and whether it's practical to use. Jeremy Hansen's geology background starts to make a lot more sense now, doesn't it? NASA had a mission specifically designed to answer some of these questions. The Viper rover, Volatile's investigating polar exploration rover, was supposed to land at the lunar South Pole in 2025 and spend 100 days drilling into the regolith, measuring the distribution and concentration of water ice. It would have been the first mission to directly sample ice from permanently shadowed regions. NASA cancelled Viper in 2024, citing cost overruns and schedule delays. The rover was already built, the hardware existed, but the program had grown too expensive and NASA's budget could not accommodate both VIP and the other Artemis commitments. It was a painful decision, and many planetary scientists considered it a significant loss. The data Viper would have provided ground truth about the nature and distribution of lunar water ice, would have been invaluable for planning future ISRU operations. The cancellation of Viper illustrates a recurring theme in NASA's budget reality. There's never enough money to do everything that needs doing. The agency must constantly choose between compelling missions, and those choices are influenced not just by scientific priority, but by political pressure, institutional momentum, and the sunk cost fallacy. Some of the knowledge Viper would have provided may eventually come from commercial landers carrying smaller instruments, but the comprehensive, systematic survey that Viper would have conducted is unlikely to be replicated anytime soon. Another piece of knowledge delayed, another question left unanswered a little longer. The permanently shadowed regions present their own engineering challenges beyond just finding and extracting ice. These craters are not merely dark, they are some of the coldest places in the entire solar system. At minus 230 degrees Celsius, most metals become brittle. Lubricants freeze solid. Electronics can malfunction or fail entirely. Battery performance degrades dramatically. Any equipment operating in a permanently shadowed crater would need to be specially designed for extreme cold. Heaters would be required to keep critical components warm enough to function, but heaters require power, and the one thing you don't have in a permanently shadowed crater is sunlight. You'd need either nuclear power or power transmitted from a sunlit location, perhaps by cable from a solar array on a nearby crater rim, or by microwave or laser beam. The peaks of eternal light, ridges and crater rims near the poles that receive near constant sunlight due to the moon's minimal axial tilt are among the most valuable real estate on the moon, precisely because they offer both solar energy and proximity to the shadowed craters where ice resides. Whoever establishes a base on one of these peaks has access to both power and water. These locations are few, they are small, and multiple nations have identified them as desirable landing sites. The question of who gets to build where, and whether multiple nations can share these limited locations, is a governance challenge that has no precedent and no clear legal framework. Let me tell you about the radiation environment on the moon, because it's one of the most significant threats to human health, and it's often glossed over in popular discussions. Earth's surface is protected from cosmic radiation by two mechanisms, the magnetosphere and the atmosphere. The magnetosphere, the magnetic field generated by Earth's liquid iron core, deflects most charged particles from the Sun and from deep space. The atmosphere absorbs much of what gets through. Together, they reduce the radiation dose at Earth's surface to levels that are easily tolerable for human biology. The Moon has neither. Its magnetic field is essentially zero, just scattered, weak remnant magnetism from its ancient past. Its atmosphere is so tenuous it might as well not exist. The lunar surface is directly exposed to three types of radiation: solar wind particles, solar energetic particles from solar flares and coronal mass ejections, and galactic cosmic rays. Solar wind particles are relatively low energy and are stopped by a space suit or a few centimeters of material. They're not a significant health concern. Solar energetic particles are a different matter. During a major solar event, a powerful flare or coronal mass ejection, the Sun can release bursts of high-energy protons and heavier ions that travel through space at a significant fraction of the speed of light. If an astronaut is on the lunar surface during such an event without adequate shielding, the radiation dose could be lethal within hours, not days, hours. The Apollo astronauts were fortunate. No major solar particle events occurred during any of the missions. But between Apollo 16 and Apollo 17, in August 1972, one of the largest solar particle events ever recorded erupted from the Sun. If an Apollo crew had been on the lunar surface during that event, they would have received a dose that could have been fatal or at minimum severely debilitating. This is not a hypothetical risk for Artemis. Solar activity follows an approximately 11-year cycle, and we are currently near or at solar maximum, the period of highest activity. Artemis 2 and 3 will fly during a time when the risk of major solar events is elevated. NASA plans to mitigate this through real-time space weather monitoring and by having the crew shelter in the most heavily shielded part of the spacecraft, typically behind water tanks or equipment if a solar storm is detected. But galactic cosmic rays are a different and in some ways more insidious problem. These are high-energy particles, protons, but also heavier nuclei like iron that originate from supernovae and other energetic events throughout the galaxy. They are constant. There is no storm to shelter from. They arrive all the time, from all directions, and they carry enormous energy. When a heavy galactic cosmic ray particle hits biological tissue, it deposits energy along its path, damaging DNA and cellular structures. The heavier the particle, the more damage it does. Iron nuclei, which represent a small but significant fraction of galactic cosmic rays, leave a trail of damage through cells that is very difficult for biological repair mechanisms to fix. The long-term health effects of galactic cosmic ray exposure are not fully understood. Animal studies suggest increased risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and central nervous system effects, including cognitive decline. But the studies are limited. The extrapolation from animals to humans is uncertain, and the exposure levels in the studies don't always match what lunar astronauts would experience. For short missions, the 10 days of Artemis II, or the few weeks of Artemis III, the galactic cosmic ray dose is manageable. It adds to the astronaut's lifetime radiation exposure, but the incremental risk is small. For long-duration lunar habitation, months or years, the cumulative dose becomes a serious concern. Shielding helps, but galactic cosmic rays are so energetic that stopping them requires meters of material. Even then, the interaction between the cosmic rays and the shielding material can produce secondary radiation, showers of lower energy particles that may themselves be harmful. This is why lunar habitat designs often propose using regolith as shielding, covering the habitat with a thick layer of lunar soil. 3 or 4 meters of regolith would provide significant protection. But you need equipment to move all that regolith, and that equipment needs to work in vacuum, in extreme temperatures, in pervasive abrasive dust. The engineering challenges cascade. There's a question that hangs over all of this, and it's worth addressing honestly. Why go back? We went to the moon. We proved we could do it. We planted flags, collected rocks, drove a car around, hit golf balls. We left and didn't go back for half a century. Why now? The surface level answers are easy. Science, resources, geopolitical competition, inspiration, all true, all insufficient. The deeper answer, I think, is that the moon is a test, not of our technology, though it is that, not of our political will, though it is that too. It's a test of whether humanity can sustain a long-term commitment to something that doesn't produce immediate returns. Going to the moon in 1969 was a sprint, a breathtaking, magnificent sprint, but sprints end. What we need now is endurance. Can we build infrastructure on the moon that outlasts a single administration, a single budget cycle, a single generation of engineers? Can we maintain a presence there the way we've maintained the International Space Station? Imperfectly, expensively, but continuously. The ISS is actually a useful precedent here, both encouraging and cautionary. It has been continuously inhabited since November of 2000. Over 23 years of unbroken human presence in space. That's an extraordinary achievement, but it required constant political negotiation between 15 partner nations. It survived cancellation threats from multiple administrations. It cost over $150 billion. And it's in low Earth orbit, 250 miles away, where resupply missions take hours and emergency evacuations are feasible. A lunar base would be 1,000 times farther away. Resupply would take days. Emergency evacuation would be difficult to impossible during most mission phases. The cost would be higher. The technical challenges would be greater. and the political commitment would need to be sustained for decades. Can we do that? I don't know, but I know that if we can't, we need to learn why, and the moon is the place to learn it, because the moon is just the beginning. If we can't sustain operations on a world that's 3 days away, we have no business talking about Mars. Mars is 7 months away at best, and there are no abort options. You don't get to come home early from Mars. Mars is a subject that deserves its own extended discussion. But let me say this, the moon-first approach makes strategic sense in a way that going directly to Mars does not. The technologies you need for Mars, long-duration life support, ISRO, radiation protection, autonomous medical care, psychological support systems for isolated crews, all of these can be developed and tested on the moon first, with the safety margin that comes from being 3 days from home, rather than 7 months. If a life support system fails on the moon, the crew can potentially survive long enough for a rescue mission, or at minimum, they can abort and return to Earth in their Orion capsule. If a life support system fails on Mars, the crew is on their own. There is no rescue mission that can reach them in time. They either fix it or they die. That is not a scenario you want to encounter with systems that haven't been thoroughly tested in an actual extraterrestrial environment. The moon is our training ground. It's where we learn to live off the land, extracting water, producing oxygen, manufacturing building materials from regolith. It's where we learn to keep humans alive in a radiation environment with no magnetosphere. It's where we test habitat designs, power systems, communication networks, medical protocols for emergencies when the nearest hospital is 250,000 miles away. Every delay in Artemis pushes that learning further into the future, and time is not a neutral factor. Climate change, resource competition, political instability, the window during which spacefaring civilizations can develop is not guaranteed to stay open forever. That might sound dramatic, maybe it is, but I've lived long enough to know that the things we assume will always be possible sometimes turn out to have been possible only briefly. The Apollo program opened a door. We walked through it, looked around and walked back out. The door didn't close, but it also didn't stay propped open automatically. Each year we don't go back. The institutional knowledge fades a little more, the public interest wanes a little more, the political will erodes a little more. Artemis is an attempt to walk through that door again, and this time put a doorstop in it. There's another piece of the Artemis architecture that deserves discussion, and it's one that has been both praised and criticized in roughly equal measure: the Gateway. Gateway is a small space station that will orbit the moon. Not in a circular orbit like the ISS orbits Earth, but in a highly elliptical, near rectilinear halo orbit, a path that takes it as close as 3,000 kilometers to the lunar surface at its nearest point, and as far as 70,000 kilometers at its farthest. One orbit takes about a week. This orbit was chosen for its stability. It requires very little fuel to maintain and for its accessibility. Spacecraft from Earth can reach it relatively easily, and landers can depart from it to reach various locations on the lunar surface, including the South Pole. Gateway will be small, at least initially. The first 2 modules, the power and propulsion element built by Maxar and the habitation and logistics outpost built by Northrop Grumman, will provide living space roughly comparable to a studio apartment. It will not be permanently inhabited. Crews will visit for periods of weeks to months, using it as a staging point for lunar surface missions. Critics argue that Gateway is unnecessary, that you could fly directly from Earth orbit to the lunar surface without stopping at an intermediate station as Apollo did. They argue that Gateway adds complexity, cost and risk to lunar missions. Some have called it a toll booth in space. something you have to pass through not because the physics requires it, but because the political architecture of Artemis demands it. There's truth to this criticism. Apollo didn't need a space station in lunar orbit. It went directly from Earth orbit to the Moon and back. The mission was simpler and in some ways more elegant, but the Artemis architecture is different from Apollo in a fundamental way. Apollo was designed for sortie missions: go, visit, come home. Artemis is designed, at least in theory, for sustained presence. Gateway enables a different operational concept. Multiple landers can be pre-positioned there, supplies can be cached. Crews can arrive and depart on different schedules. It becomes a hub, a logistics node, a place where you can store equipment and fuel for multiple surface missions. Whether this operational concept justifies the cost and complexity of Gateway is a legitimate debate, but the concept itself is sound. If you're serious about sustained lunar presence, having infrastructure in lunar orbit makes sense. The question is whether Gateway, as designed and as funded, actually delivers that capability, or whether it's a scaled-down compromise that provides just enough to be useful but not enough to be transformative. The European Space Agency is building the main habitation module's life support system and contributing other elements. Japan is providing life support components and possibly a logistics resupply vehicle. Canada is building the Canadarm3 robotic arm. Gateway is by design an international project, distributing both the cost and the political benefits across multiple partners. This international dimension is important for reasons beyond cost sharing. It creates diplomatic entanglement. Once multiple nations have contributed hardware to Gateway, it becomes politically very difficult for any single nation, particularly the United States, to cancel it. The investment of partner nations creates inertia. That inertia can be frustrating when you want to change course, but it also provides stability in a domain where programs are perpetually at risk of cancellation. Let me talk about spacesuits, because the suits that Artemis astronauts will wear on the Moon represent one of the most quietly revolutionary aspects of the entire program. The spacesuits used on Apollo were engineering marvels of their time, but they were also miserable to wear. The suits were stiff, restrictive, and exhausting to work in. The gloves were so inflexible that astronauts' fingernails sometimes fell off from the effort of gripping tools against the suit's internal pressure. The field of vision was limited. Mobility was severely constrained, especially in the lower body. Walking was possible, but bending, kneeling, and working close to the ground was extremely difficult. For Artemis, NASA contracted with Axiom Space to develop the Axiom Extravehicular Mobility Unit, the Axiom. This is a next-generation spacesuit designed specifically for lunar surface operations. The Axiom incorporates advances in materials, joint design, and life support that significantly improve mobility and comfort. The joints use bearing systems that allow a much greater range of motion than Apollo suits. Astronauts can walk more naturally, bend at the waist, kneel, and work at ground level, critical capabilities for geological sampling and equipment deployment. The helmet offers a wider field of vision. The gloves are more dexterous, still a compromise between protection and tactility, but a better compromise than Apollo achieved. The life support system is more capable, providing longer spacewalk durations and better thermal management. But perhaps the most significant advancement is sizing. Apollo suits were custom built for each astronaut, which was expensive and time-consuming. The Axiom is designed with a modular sizing system, interchangeable components that can be adjusted to fit a wide range of body sizes. This matters because the astronaut corps is more diverse than it was in the 1960s. Women in particular need suits that fit properly. not suits designed for male bodies and scaled down. The Aximu was designed from the start for inclusivity. There's a famous incident from 2019 when a planned all-female spacewalk on the ISS had to be reconfigured because there weren't enough medium-sized suit components available. Only one medium torso hard upper torso, the rigid chest piece of the suit, was configured for use, and 2 astronauts needed it. That incident highlighted a decades-old problem in spacesuit design. The Aximu is intended to prevent such situations. The development of the Aximu has not been without challenges. Axiom Space has faced technical hurdles, schedule pressures, and the inherent difficulty of building a garment that must keep a human alive in one of the most hostile environments imaginable, while still allowing that human to do useful work. The suit must protect against vacuum, temperature extremes, micrometeorite impacts, radiation and dust, all while being comfortable enough to wear for 8 or more hours. It's worth pausing to appreciate what a spacesuit actually is. It's not clothing, it's a personal spacecraft. It has its own atmosphere, its own pressure regulation, its own thermal management, its own communications, its own power supply, its own waste management. When an astronaut steps outside the spacecraft in a spacesuit, they are, in every functional sense, a tiny, independently operating spacecraft in the shape of a human being. There's a parallel story unfolding that doesn't get as much attention, but might ultimately be more consequential than Artemis. Private companies are going to the moon, not someday. Now, Intuitive Machines landed their Odysseus spacecraft near the lunar South Pole in February 2024. It tipped over on landing, one of its legs caught on the surface, but it still transmitted data. It was the first American-built spacecraft to land on the moon since Apollo 17 in 1972, and it was built by a company in Houston with about 500 employees. The story of that landing is worth telling in detail because it illustrates both the promise and the peril of commercial lunar exploration. Odysseus, also designated IM-1 for Intuitive Machines Mission 1, launched atop a SpaceX Falcon 9. The spacecraft made the 3-day journey to the moon and entered its descent sequence. But during the final approach, the navigation system failed. The primary laser rangefinder, the instrument that measures altitude and descent rate, had not been enabled. It had been left in a safe mode due to a pre-launch procedural error. The crew at Intuitive Machines' Houston Control Center realized the problem and devised a workaround in real time. They used an experimental NASA payload aboard the lander, a sensor package that had its own terrain relative navigation capability to provide backup altitude data. They essentially reprogrammed the landing sequence during descent using an instrument that wasn't designed for that purpose. It worked, mostly. The lander reached the surface, but the substitute navigation data wasn't as precise as the primary system would have been. Odysseus came in slightly too fast and at a slight angle. One of its landing legs caught a surface feature, and the spacecraft tipped over, coming to rest on its side. Despite being on its side, Odysseus operated for about 7 days. Its solar panels, oriented sideways rather than skyward, generated enough power to run instruments and transmit data during the limited windows when sunlight hit them. NASA received valuable data from several of its payloads, but the mission also demonstrated how unforgiving the moon is. A single procedural error, leaving a sensor in safe mode, nearly caused the loss of the entire vehicle. On the moon, there are no second chances. There is no tech support van driving out to the landing site. There are no spare parts. There is no room for the kind of mistakes that on Earth would be inconvenient rather than catastrophic. Firefly Aerospace launched their Blue Ghost lander, and successfully reached the lunar surface in early 2025. These are commercial lunar payload services. NASA pays for rides, but the companies build and operate the spacecraft. Japan's ISpace attempted a landing with their Hakuto R lander. It crashed, but they're building a second one. And Japan's National Space Agency, JAXA, successfully landed their slim spacecraft, though it also ended up on its nose. The pattern is clear. Multiple entities, nations and companies are attempting lunar landings with increasing frequency. Some succeed, some fail, some succeed partially. But the cadence is accelerating in the early 2020s. A lunar landing attempt was a major event. By the late 2020s, they may become routine. What's emerging is a lunar economy, small at first, mostly scientific payloads, but the trajectory is clear. As landing costs come down and reliability goes up, the moon becomes accessible to universities, research institutions, and eventually commercial ventures. The question is, accessible for what? Mining is the most commonly cited answer, and lunar water ice is the most commonly cited resource. But there are others. Helium-3, an isotope rare on Earth but potentially abundant on the moon, could theoretically fuel future fusion reactors. The lunar regolith contains helium-3 implanted by the solar wind over billions of years. Estimates of the total quantity vary, but some suggest there are millions of tons of helium-3 on the moon. The catch is that fusion power using helium-3 doesn't exist yet. The physics works in principle. Deuterium-helium-3 fusion produces fewer neutrons than other fusion reactions, which means less radioactive waste and less damage to reactor components. But no one has built a working helium-3 fusion reactor. No one has built a working fusion reactor of any kind that produces net energy, though that milestone may be approaching with projects like ITER and various private fusion ventures. So helium-3 mining is a resource extraction plan that depends on a power generation technology that doesn't exist yet. That's a lot of dependency. But if fusion works, and there are reasons to be cautiously optimistic, the value of lunar helium-3 could be enormous. Enough to justify the cost of extraction and return to Earth. Rare Earth elements might be extractable from lunar regolith. Even the simple act of manufacturing in 1/6 gravity and hard vacuum could enable production of materials impossible to make on Earth: ultra-pure crystals, specialized alloys, unique pharmaceutical compounds. This is speculative, all of it. No one has a business plan for lunar mining that closes financially with current technology. The economics don't work yet. But economics are not fixed. They evolve as technology improves and demand shifts. The economics of satellite communications didn't work in 1960. They generate billions today. The moon might follow a similar arc. First, science and exploration funded by governments. Then technology demonstration funded by venture capital. Then genuine commercial operations funded by revenue. The timeline might be decades, it might be longer. But the direction feels clear. There's another potential lunar resource that's almost never discussed in popular media, but that some space architects consider the most valuable of all: location. The moon's surface is a platform. It's a stable, airless, low-gravity platform with a clear view of the sky and direct access to the vacuum of space. For astronomy, the lunar far side is potentially the best location in the inner solar system for certain types of observations. Radio telescopes on the far side would be shielded from Earth's radio noise by the bulk of the moon itself. 2,000 miles of rock blocking every cell phone, TV station, and radar system on Earth. For low-frequency radio astronomy, wavelengths that can't even penetrate Earth's ionosphere, the lunar far side is the only accessible location where you can observe at all. For gravitational wave detection, the moon's seismic stability, and low thermal noise could enable detectors far more sensitive than anything possible on Earth. For optical telescopes, the lack of atmosphere means no seeing, no weather, no light pollution. A telescope on the Moon could operate at its theoretical diffraction limit all the time. These applications are decades away from realization, but they illustrate a point. The Moon's value extends beyond what you can dig out of its soil. Its value includes what you can do from its surface. There are currently about 44 active astronauts in NASA's core. Most of them will never go to the Moon. Some will fly to the space station. A few might fly on commercial stations being developed by Axiom, Blue Origin, and others. But the Moon, the math is simple and cruel. Artemis missions are planned roughly once a year, maybe less. Each mission carries 4 crew. Some of those slots go to international partners, Canada, ESA, JAXA. Over the next decade, maybe 20 NASA astronauts will fly Artemis missions, maybe fewer. That means most of the astronaut corps is training for something they will statistically never do. They know this, they train anyway. Because when you're an astronaut, hope is not optional. It's part of the job description. And there's another group waiting, the astronaut candidates who haven't been selected yet. NASA's most recent class was chosen in 2021 from over 12,000 applicants. 10 people selected from 12,000. The odds of becoming an astronaut are roughly comparable to the odds of playing in the NFL, except the NFL draft happens every year. NASA selects a class every 4 to 6 years. The selection process itself is extraordinary. The basic qualifications are a master's degree in a STEM field and either 1,000 hours of pilot in command time in jet aircraft or 2 years of professional experience in a related field. But the basic qualifications get you through the door. The actual selection involves physical and psychological evaluations that are among the most rigorous in any profession. The psychological evaluation is particularly interesting. NASA isn't just looking for smart, fit, technically skilled people. They're looking for people who can function under extreme stress, in confined spaces with small groups of people, for extended periods, without losing their effectiveness or their equanimity. They're looking for what psychologists call expeditionary behavior, the ability to maintain performance, manage interpersonal relationships, and sustain motivation in isolated, confined environments. This means that some of the most technically brilliant applicants are rejected because they don't have the right psychological profile. Being a genius doesn't help if you can't share a small space with 3 other people for 10 days without conflict. Being a world-class pilot doesn't help if you can't subordinate your ego to a team dynamic when the situation requires it. The result is that astronauts tend to be a peculiar blend of exceptional competence and exceptional agreeableness. They are intensely driven people who have learned to channel their drive into collaborative effort rather than individual competition. This is harder than it sounds, and it's one reason why the selection ratio is so extreme. The people who will walk on the Moon in 2035 might be in graduate school right now, studying geology, medicine, engineering, running experiments, flying planes, serving in the military. They don't know yet that they'll be astronauts. They might not even be sure they want to be. But the path they're on, whether they realize it or not, is converging toward a moment when someone will hand them a spacesuit and say, "You're going." That's a remarkable thing to contemplate. Let me talk about the overview effect, because it's relevant to what the Artemis II crew will experience, and it's one of the most consistently reported psychological phenomena in the history of spaceflight. The term was coined by Frank White in 1987, but the experience itself has been described by astronauts since the earliest spaceflights. It's the cognitive shift that occurs when you see Earth from space, particularly from a distance where the entire planet is visible as a single object. Astronauts describe it in remarkably consistent terms: a sense of the Earth's fragility, an awareness of the thinness of the atmosphere, the barely visible blue line that separates life from void, a feeling of interconnectedness that political borders, cultural divisions, and national identities are human constructions that are invisible from orbit, a sense of profound responsibility that this small blue world is all we have and we are not taking adequate care of it. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon during Apollo 14, described it as an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. He later founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, dedicated to studying consciousness, a direct result of his lunar experience. Not every astronaut experiences the overview effect with equal intensity. Some report it as a mild sense of wonder. Others describe it as a transformative, almost spiritual experience that permanently altered their worldview. The variation likely depends on personality, predisposition, and the specific circumstances of the observation. But here's what makes Artemis II special in this context. The crew won't just see Earth from low orbit, where it fills the window and still looks large and proximate. They'll see Earth from 250,000 miles away, where it shrinks to something you can cover with your thumb. They'll see it as the Apollo astronauts saw it, as a small, isolated sphere in an immense void, impossibly bright against the blackness. Only 24 people have ever seen that view. The Artemis II crew will become the 25th through 28th. What they feel, what they think, what they carry back from that experience, it matters not just for them personally, but for the rest of us who will never have that vantage point. William Anders, who took the famous Earthrise photo during Apollo 8, said, "We came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing is that we discovered the Earth." That photograph, Earth rising above the lunar horizon, blue and white against the void, is widely credited with helping catalyze the environmental movement. It showed humanity what we stood to lose. The Artemis II crew will take new photographs. They'll have better cameras. The images will be sharper, more detailed, more vivid. But I wonder if they'll have the same impact. In 1968, the Earthrise photo showed us something we'd never seen before. Today we've seen it. We've seen it on posters, in textbooks, on screensavers. The image has become familiar, and familiarity dulls impact. What might restore the impact is not a photograph, but a testimony. A human voice speaking from the vicinity of the moon, describing what they see and what they feel. The rawness of first-person experience, unmediated by a camera lens, might reach people in a way that another photograph cannot. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen, their words from that distance might matter as much as any data their instruments collect. There are artifacts on the moon, not just from Apollo, from many missions, but the Apollo artifacts are the most poignant. 6 landing sites, 6 sets of descent stages, the bottom halves of the lunar modules, still sitting there, legs splayed on the regolith. They'll be there for millions of years. There's no weather to erode them, no scavengers to dismantle them, no oxidation to rust them. They'll outlast every structure on Earth. At the Apollo 11 site, there's a small silicon disk containing goodwill messages from 73 world leaders shrunk to microscopic size. There's an American flag, though it's almost certainly been bleached white by decades of unfiltered ultraviolet radiation. There are boot prints in the dust that will persist for millions of years, undisturbed by wind or rain, because there is no wind and there is no rain. Actually, let me pause on that. Millions of years. That's not an exaggeration for effect. The moon's surface changes so slowly that the boot prints left by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in July of 1969 will be recognizable for at least 10 million years, and possibly much longer. The only processes that would degrade them are micrometeorite impacts, tiny particles hitting the surface at high velocity and disturbing the regolith, and the gradual churning caused by thermal expansion and contraction as the surface cycles between lunar day and night. These processes are real, but they're extraordinarily slow. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has photographed the Apollo landing sites from orbit, and the boot prints, rover tracks, and equipment are clearly visible, unchanged after more than 50 years. In 10 million years, micrometeorite bombardment will have reworked the top few centimeters of regolith enough to blur the prints. In 100 million years, they'll be gone. But 100 million years is a time span during which entire species evolve and go extinct, continents drift thousands of miles, and ocean basins open and close. The boot prints will outlast human civilization. That's not pessimism, it's just math. No human civilization has ever lasted 100 million years. The oldest known civilizations are 10,000 years old at most. The moon doesn't care about our time scales. It operates on its own.